Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here for this timely discussion. My name is Nidhi Upadhyay, and I am the Senior Research Associate at the South Asia Center. With India going into general elections early next year, it is a crucial time for us to understand and analyze the current situation and what the future holds for the country. We are very pleased to welcome Mr. Bharat Karnad at the Atlantic Council to discuss his most recent book, Staggering Forward, Narendra Modi and India's Global Ambition. Mr. Karnad is a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi and has served as a member of India's National Security Advisory Board, where he helped draft the nation's nuclear doctrine. He has also advised India's Finance Commission on defense expenditures. Mr. Karnad has been a visiting scholar at Princeton University, the University of Pennsylvania, the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies, and the Stimson Center in Washington. And he lectures regularly at top military training institutions. He has also authored the books Nuclear Weapons in Indian Security, The Realist Foundations of Strategy, India's Nuclear Policy, and Why India is Not a Great Power Yet. He has a BA and an MA in Political Science from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and the University of California, Los Angeles, respectively. Mr. Karnad's book is a critical analysis of the Modi government's initiatives over the last 4 years and what they mean for his administration as well as the country in the future. The book reflects on the impact of his policies domestically, regionally, as well as globally. We're looking forward to hear more about it. But before we turn to you for your thoughts, I would also like to introduce our moderator for today's conversation. We are pleased to welcome back our center's founding director, Mr. Shuja Nawaz, who is currently a distinguished fellow with the center. Mr. Nawaz has previously worked with RAND Corporation, the United States Institute of Peace, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and other leading think tanks on projects dealing with Pakistan and the Middle East. He has advised senior government and military officials and parliamentarians in the United States, Europe, and Pakistan. Mr. Nawaz has also worked for the New York Times, the World Health Organization, and has headed 3 separate divisions at the International Monetary Fund. I would like to mention here that Mr. Nawaz has authored multiple books and publications, and we're looking forward to his next book, which is planned to be published soon. Thank you both for your time. I would like to now turn to Mr. Karnad for his opening remarks on the book.
I think one of your most important qualifications is you share the name with me. Except I have an age.
Thank you very much. I think I've been given 10 minutes to sort of outline the book, and which I'll do. If there's some aspects I sort of alight on, you might just note it down for further elaboration as we get into the interactive stage. Essentially, the first 2 chapters deal with a comparative analysis of the strong men, alpha male leaders that we have across the globe. Shinzo Abe in Japan, going from east to west. Modi in India, Erdogan in Turkey, Xi in China, of course, Putin in Russia, and Trump in the United States. Remarkably, they share many traits. Some of them are very obvious. They are autocratic, very self-centered. Most everything that happens in their countries is about them. They also are what I call in terms of David Rosen's phenotypes, in terms of psychological profiles and so on, they're narcissists in the sense that they make very convincing liars. They are paranoid, of course, they're autocratic, and so on and so forth. Many of these traits you obviously see in these leaders. The one thing that is very curiously similar and common to them, perhaps not for Xi so much, is that they also have used religion as means of advantaging themselves politically. Putin in particular, because he was in the 5th Directorate, when he was there, he, in a sense, gave life to the Russian Orthodox Church and gave back to the Church their vast wealth and holdings and so on. And they now back Putin politically. In India, of course, Modi, Erdogan, using his right-wing Islamist tendencies in Turkey. Xi has his own secular version. It's not so different from the old Confucian notions of harmony under the Tianxia system, which is really harmony under the heaven. That's the basic concept. Harmony under the heaven on Chinese terms. That's the whole point. What I do in the third chapter, I refer to the impact of Modi on foreign policy, on foreign and military policy, generally on policy making in India. And because it's so top-down, most of the usual processes of government in the Indian system have been sidelined. Most secretaries to the government of India are called in by the Prime Minister and issued instructions. So, it's like governed by obiter dicta, in a sense. You just are asked to do things. The most obvious kind of an example of this is the Rafale contract that you all have heard of, 36 combat aircraft that were acquired literally on the spur of the moment. At least that's how it was announced in Paris when the Prime Minister was there in April 2015. Even as a Foreign Secretary accompanying him, Jaishankar, had no clue until the Prime Minister announced it, which is really quite extraordinary, because an awful lot of work usually goes into these kinds of deals, high-value deals, and that didn't happen. The reason the 36 Rafale, of course, I wrote at the time that it's going to blow up in Modi's face. It has blown up now in Modi's face. There's something called the Cabinet Committee on Security in India, which really has to approve all major deals. That was bypassed in Delhi. And so what you have is a system where the basic processes are undermined, the procedures are undermined, and if nothing else in India, it's an over-bureaucratized state. Now, when you do that, you sideline the bureaucracy and their normal way of doing things. What you end up doing is alienating the bureaucracy, which basically means your implementors of your agenda and policy are now, in a sense, against you, working against you, because they have no stake in it. Because they have no stake in it, well, in the Indian bureaucratic system, many of you have been exposed to the Indian bureaucracy, which is very resilient. That's one way of putting it. Other thing is they are generalists, generally, who have no expertise of any kind and do not take well to outside expertise or advice or anything of the kind. And neither does Mr. Modi. Some of his insights into the man were, in fact, revealed by Modi to his many biographers. You don't have to go far. You just have to read the many biographies of Modi, where he has revealed himself. For instance, he says about his, I've sort of jocularly, not so jocularly, only half jokingly said that he thinks he's his own best think tank, for instance, because he has said that he was asked, well, what about how do you get your ideas? And I'm nearly quoting him verbatim. He says, this is a God-given gift. Okay, that's nice, but so this is what he believes, that he has a view on everything. He needs no help from anybody, and that all he needs to do is outline the policy for the civil servants to flesh these options out and work them. Most of the way he works in the government, his method, assuming that that's what it is, he learned during his apprenticeship, if I may call it that, with the RSS, the right-wing social service organization, as they call themselves, the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, RSS. There he has said that I was taught the basics and the techniques of organization and management. So not only is he his own best think tank, he was also schooled in the RSS School of Business and Organization. So the RSS is an extremely hierarchical organization, where the head of RSS is like virtually a king. And if many of you have been following what Mohan Bhagwat, who is now the present head of RSS, and the ideological core of this particular government in any case, and Modi was an office holder in the RSS. He was a pracharak, which essentially means what's the right word? One who's a teacher. Teachers, in a sense, propagating the RSS view. He was one of those. So, and he was pulled up by the RSS because of organizational skills. So this is a man who's used to hierarchy, who's used, again, in the RSS method to order things. Having reached the top, he expects, therefore, that everybody will now defer to his views and that he will, and they'll implement his ideas. That's not how the Indian government works. And therefore, most of the policies that we have, foreign military policies since 2014, are basically continuation of past policies, except, there's absolutely nothing that is new. Just about every policy line is a continuation of what, is a follow-up on what happened in the Manmohan Singh government, including the Rafale contract. So, except he's, he's a sort of a decisive sort of person. That's what he portrays himself. I've criticized in this book his foreign policy as a creeper wine foreign policy. That's basically, a creeper wine is not necessarily, for the wine to rise, has to, in a sense, bind itself around some pole or a trellis or something. If you remove that, it'll fall down. In other words, I use that as a context for Modi's over-tilt to the United States. I don't think, there's some confusion. I think even in US policy circles, I'm not sure, but there's certainly there in the US, that insofar as you share the aims and objectives of containing and hedging China's options, that you necessarily also therefore have convergent strategies. You may share the same aims and objectives. That does not necessarily mean you also have a common strategy, or that because you are in very different situations. Different countries have different imperatives, and that is something I don't think the Prime Minister still realizes. He essentially thinks he's out there trying to, as I say in the book, win brownie points with the Trump administration, and in trying to some ways curry favor, even as Trump treats Modi as he does everybody else, with complete disdain. Just because Modi's great innovation and diplomatic innovation, assuming that's what it is the hugging and the embracing and so on and so forth. Now, this is all very well. It's often, when the Western leaders involved, they're very awkward and they don't know just how to respond. You'll find Hollande, who is now in the news, stiff while Modi has his arms around him and in a bear hug. But Trump was very good. He was startled for a moment, even though, as I was told, he was told that that's what you're going to get, a big embrace. But he responded reasonably well, and then Modi took that to mean that, well, I have a special relationship with Trump. Just about everything Trump has done should have disabused him of any great closeness that he has somehow secured for India during the Trump administration. Just about every issue that Trump has held dear, from H-1B visas, which his government has been pleading with every passing US visitor through Delhi, the US government has turned him down. On trade, for instance, the tariffs have been imposed on Indian steel, aluminum, and so on and so forth, light manufacturers. And India has not responded in kind, even as every other country, including European countries, have responded immediately with counter tariffs. So this is where we are at. when I say that the strategies are not common, even though they're shared objectives, then the mechanisms of the security mechanisms to ensure your own protection, the country's security in Asia, also will be different. And in this book, I've kind of elaborated on two aspects. One is the BRICS. How do you weaponize BRICS? And one of the chapters there talks about BRICS minus China. And similarly, I've talked about a modified quadrilateral, or mod quad, as I call it, wherein the US is substituted by the ASEAN. The way I've described it, very simply, these are weaponized coalitions against China. They do not in any way, other than getting America and China out of the main coalition groupings. Why? Because anytime you have groupings with the US or China, that group then revolves around the Chinese and American interest, do they not? As dominant powers, that's what happens. Once you remove the proto-hegemons, as I call them, from these groupings, then you have your own interests, and your own economic links are far more equitable. In BRICS, for instance, once you take out China, the intra-BRICS trade and economic linkages are more equal. Similarly, you have in Mod Quad, if you take out the United States, the rest of the four countries, meaning ASEAN, of course, the new entrant, the Japan, India, and Australia. In the Mod Quad, Australia is the only sub-trillion-dollar economy at present. India, ASEAN, and Japan are trillion-dollar economies. We can then have a far greater convergence of interests absent the United States. The US can come in anytime. We can rely on the US, we can make common cause with it, but we shouldn't, as I've argued, rely centrally on the United States to get pick our security chestnuts out of the fire, because that is our business, security is our business, so that's what I call organic security. Security organic to the nations in Asia. These are generally the aspects in the book. Anything else that anybody may wish to bring out, we can talk about it. Shuja?
Thank you very much, Bharat.
Just one, I'm sorry. Before you get in, I know your antecedents, but so I should say this. I've always been arguing for the last 35 years that we have been fixating on Pakistan to the detriment of our own strategic calculus and our own interests. We have a much larger threat and challenge in China, which we need to address. Pakistan is not a threat, cannot be a military threat to India, never was, is not now, can never be.
Thank you for clarifying that, Bharat. I remember a dinner that we had at a common friend's home in Delhi where we debated long into the night on this issue because, of course, I always knew you as the author of the Bharat Karnad Sialkot grab plan. But then a month after that dinner, you sent me an article you wrote for the Times of India, I think, on rethinking Pakistan, which I thought was a very brave thing to do, particularly in today's India. And I'm sure the Bhakts must have come for you, the way you were presenting the idea that India should move one of the strike corps away from the Pakistan border, and the fact that 36% of the Indian defense budget is Pakistan-centric. It's a very brave thing to say, particularly today in India. And I'm sure once I get to read this book, which I haven't yet, I'll be able to understand much more of where you want things to go. I'll just say a few things, and then we'll open it up for questions, because I think that conversation, particularly with the audience that we have and people that know the region much better than I do, we'll probably come out the better for it. First of all, I think on the psychological profile of leadership that you present, I'm sure that there probably will not be much debate, particularly in this town, and particularly since the events of the last year or two. The narcissistic, or some were saying initially ego-driven, I say id-driven, more than ego-driven, actions of political leaders, something that we are familiar with. The other is the quotation, my favorite quotation from Alice in Wonderland, that when you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there, which seems to be the guiding principle of some of the politics that now inhabits the South Asian region, not just India. I do have one question, which is that I think there's one entity in India, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, which probably is the master of the long game, and that is the Indian bureaucracy. And I think any politician, whether in India or in Pakistan, that thinks that he can manage to tame that beast is mistaken. They know how to slow things down, and they know how to run rings around you. They also know how to leak stuff. And so even the Rafale deal started off with a big bang and then kept cutting back and back and back, and now it's 36 aircraft, which may have trouble being assimilated into the Indian defense structure because of other problems. The U.S. relationship is something that you raise, and I agree with you. I think India would be much better off playing its recognized role as a leader in the greater South Asia context, to have connectivity with its neighbors, to be a much bigger player on the global stage, rather than being co-opted by the United States as a kind of tonto to the U.S. Lone Ranger, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, because the assumption that India will follow the U.S. in trying to contain China doesn't really take into account China's ability to dominate that region, which they've already established themselves using trade policy and exchange rates. So there are people in this room that know much more about China than I do, but I think that's something to keep in mind. It would be in India's interest, really, to take a second look at the region and see if it can create some stability and economic growth in the region. So India becomes, and South Asia becomes, a kind of center of gravity of the global economy. I was curious about your use of the term bris. Of course, people familiar with Yiddish or Jewish customs would probably read much more into that term, and so we'll stay away from it. But I think it's much better to be locally oriented, and maybe you can say a little bit more about that. Two things maybe you can talk about. One is the coming elections. I know that this is not the subject of your book, but everyone's focused on it, particularly on the major three states, Rajasthan and Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh, and what you see as possible scenarios. I'm not looking for predictions because that's a fraught exercise. But from all accounts, the only possible way that Modi could risk losing these states and then set the ball rolling for losing the next election would be if the Congress Party and the BSP unite. And as of yesterday, they've decided to part ways. And they haven't offered an alternative. So they don't know where they're going either. So maybe some thoughts from you on that. And then what happens if Prime Minister Modi wins the next election? What's the likely scenario? Is it obviously not going to be a landslide victory and not a mandate for change? So his 15-year dream may not materialize. But then what will it do to India and particularly to the Indian economy because he has to create 12 to 15 million jobs a year, and India is not coming anywhere close to that, given its current economic prospects. So let me just throw out these thoughts and questions and see if you want to answer them before we go to the audience for their questions and have a conversation.
No, I think one of the biggest weaknesses of Modi's policies is that he simply has not created the employment in the scale he promised. Some 12 million youth enter the job market every year, which is the population of Australia. And we are nowhere in the running to get these people jobs. There's a insidious cycle there, because these ill-educated youth, or whatever you may call them, who can't find jobs, then are the lumpen element that actually then join the Hindu fringe to terrorize societies and to polarize and disrupt a fairly lenient and tolerant Indian society that's been traditionally so. This is the awful thing, that we're getting into that cycle. And they are the strong arm, in a sense, of the RSS. Because these are fringe groups that are affiliated with the RSS. Though, of course, if you ask any RSS functionary, they'll disavow any connection with these people. But they seek the sanction, political sanction, from the fact that Modi is in power and BJP is in power, and that RSS is the driver, ideological driver. So that's the kind of situation you're in. As to the elections, I am a person close to me and who's now, I think, left the BJP from a border constituency of Barmer, who was just one saying his son, actually, Manvendra. Yeah. Manvendra says that BJP is going to lose Rajasthan. And that will be the beginning of, in one sense, the unraveling of the Modi regime, as many see it. So you have, if Rajasthan goes away, then you have, next up is Jharkhand, then Uttar Pradesh. Uttar Pradesh is the big cow belt, and, you know, he has installed his Hindu mystic or yogi or whatever he is, who is the chief minister, and whether or not he has reached any religious heights, he's certainly proved himself a complete bureaucratic dud. You know, he's run the government into the ground. If Modi has done some such thing at the center, this guy has completely run the government into the ground in the main province, the largest, population-wise largest state. So Uttar Pradesh is then lost to BJP. The arithmetic doesn't work for him. No matter if they win all the other seats, meaning if they retain the seats the BJP has won in the last elections, if they lose Uttar Pradesh and they lose Rajasthan, then Jharkhand they're going to win. So Uttar Pradesh again is dicey. You know, Yogi Adityanath, who is the chief minister, you know, is playing the Hindu card, but not very aggressively, because he still wants to be seen as a more mature kind of leader. Because actually, many in the RSS hope that he'll be successor to Modi and be the to lead the BJP. That's going to be a disaster whenever that happens. In terms of you know, Pakistan, I think I've always said that Pakistan is eminently co-optable. If you think India is co-optable in terms of in the American you know, calculi, strategic calculi, and of course it doesn't fit. As I said, you share the aims and so on, objectives, but not the same strategies. Pakistan, actually, we have so much that we need to share in terms of, and it's not just one strike corps that you mentioned. I've said demobilize all the 3 strike corps. So you have been very generous in saying I've been advocating the demobilization of 1 strike corps. I've said 3 strike corps, and the recomposition of the 3 strike corps, armored and mechanized, into 1 composite corps with independent armored brigades to take care of any Pakistan contingency, more than sufficient. And to switch the manpower and material resources to formation of offensive mountain corps to take the fight to China on the Tibetan Plateau. That's what I've been saying for 30 years. Certainly this was, because it's all covered by the Official Secrets Act, but this was what I recommended in my classified report to the 10th Finance Commission way back in 1995 when we submitted the report. Which, by the way, is what the Indian government is following 30 years on. There's always a lag time in the government doing things that should have been done 30 years ago. So we have, the first offensive mountain corps is underforming, is under raising right now, but the finance minister says he can't find the monies for it. But he can find the monies to sustain the 3 strike corps, 1, 2, and 21. 2 corps is the strike corps. The other 2 corps are, again strike corps, but in pivotal formations. So this is the kind of muddle that I've discussed in the book. The Indian military, very much like the Indian government, is muddle-headed. You know most of the senior members running the 3 services, and their entire focus and vision is so, shall we say, it's so truncated in terms of they can't see China. They say, well, China will be dealt with by the politicians. Okay, and so you are left to deal with who or what? Pakistan. So they reduce themselves by their own devices to shrink themselves really, to equating themselves with Pakistan, the much smaller foe, inconsequential foe, when you have the much larger challenge that goes unaddressed. What else? Is there anything else? Sorry,
I had one thought,
Which
quickly, if I may.
Yeah.
Just quickly, if I may. Wanted to say, if you could say a few words about the Russia relationship, particularly with the S-400 purchase, because that will create an issue with the U.S.
Putin is in Delhi today.
Yes, he's in Delhi today, and the S-400 agreement is going to be signed. But the problem, I think, is this is what I've said from the very beginning after the CATSA sanctions came on, that this is the kind of pistol head to India's head that we can't afford to have. You can't get to, India cannot afford to be in a situation where the U.S. is holding a pistol, the CATSA sanctions over India's head at all times, that they're going to pull the trigger. And that's the threat you have. And I've said you cannot get into the situation. And even when CATSA was being conceived here and there was talk in Delhi and all, I pointed this out, but the government sort of, like Titanic, I think, keeps plowing into the iceberg. But that said, the point, I think, is that CATSA is the conditional waiver you have for the S-400 cannot be guaranteed for any other purchase, which is what has been made clear by both Pompeo and Mattis when they were there for the 2+2 or 2+2, whatever it is called, talks in Delhi. So that's not on. And if you have this, whatever the metaphor, Democracy's sword or a pistol to your head, is the same thing. You are under duress. Your Indian government is making policies under duress. You never know when the boom is going to be lowered. And that's what we can't afford to have. And this is a manifestation of what I call the creeper wine foreign policy, that you depend so much on one side, one great power, that you end up undermining your own national interests. The more important thing is not S-400. What the Russians are doing now are very centrally indicating that they'll create a nexus with China and Pakistan. If they create such a nexus, they're already in bed with the Chinese. Now, if Pakistan joins them, they'll make for some very strange bedfellows. That's true. But on the other hand, it might be a going concern in terms of strategically upsetting all calculations. This is a real problem. And what is right? And I've been told there was someone close to Putin, who is in the Kremlin insider. He came to Delhi and he met with me, and he said that, and this is there in the book, wherein he says that the circles in the Kremlin and in the Soviet military, who were traditionally very friendly towards India, are now distancing themselves. Which he said is a bad thing to happen. And therefore, you may soon find a situation where something like the second Akula that's under Lee's negotiation right now may not happen. The Russians are saying, well, with the Comcasa that's just been signed, again, I advocated against signing the Comcasa, against signing the logistics support agreement, primarily because you always have the option of allowing US forces to refuel, replenish at Indian ports or air bases, or stage out of Indian air bases, which was done during the Gulf War in 1990s. You didn't need the LSA to do this. All you've done is, in a sense, restricted your own options. Now, the US has retained its options. They're saying we'll give you a conditional CATSA waiver, but we have given away the store. Now, of course, you talk to the MEA diplomats or people in the MOD, and they say, well, no, we can always say still a case by case. No, it's not. If you look at the language, it's not case by case. It's a legal sanction, authorization. So this is where things are going wrong. And one last thing as to why, and this is very curious, why Modi is so pro-America, which many of you may be interested in. Here's a guy, for him, his foreign policy is very aspirational. So befriending America, being close to America is for him an aspirational thing, because when he was a young person, he traveled through backpacking through America. He traveled through 29 states. I've lived a third of my life in the US, and I haven't traveled through so many states. And this Modi has backpacked through 29 states. He really admires America in a way that is in many ways difficult for me to understand, not because there are not obvious kind of values and virtues you don't appreciate in America, but in terms of how fully he thinks that getting close to America will, in some ways, help India become another America in Asia or something. I have no idea. It's very difficult because that connecting link has never been made clear, and I can't kind of divine it other than in these terms that he feels great admiration for America.
Thank you. Bharat, you want to say something?
Or a question.
You have a question?
A question, I don't want to say something, but I'll wait for you.
Okay, I just, quick reaction. I think the Russians are masters at smoke and mirrors. And so I think they've done a masterly job with India and Pakistan both. And even the so-called collaboration with the Chinese, maybe Shahid Yusuf or somebody that knows that region well can shed some light on it. It was done in order to create this impression that there was this grand strategy at work. But it serves their purpose. On the deals, particularly on the logistical and transit and other agreements with the United States, I think India would do well to talk to their Pakistani friends to see the draft or the final agreements that the boilerplates that the Pentagon produced and got the Pakistanis to sign in 2001 and later years. They're first of all in Pentagonese, so they're unreadable and unintelligible. And secondly, they are really very one-sided. And I think India would be well in its right to carefully read them and change the language so that they have options to opt out or options to increase payments or whatever for the use of their air and land facilities. So just two things. I'm sorry that, when you get two military wonk types get together, you get into weeds like this. But I'm sure that there's a much wider discussion to be held with the people in this room. So let me ask Bharat if you'd like to say something.
I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions, and starting where you left, our leadership met Modi in 2015, right after when the euphoria was very high. And they asked him precisely the same question. They said, what is your admiration for the United States? And Fred asked him in so many words, despite you being banned on a visa grounds from entering the United States. And his response was, he said, look at all the places in the world, and where do Indians do best? And the answer for me, that is America. And why should I stand in between their dreams? And we took it at face value in return. But I think the point or the question that I wanted to ask you was, once again connected to 2015 or 2014 when he was inaugurated. He said India's destiny lies in its neighborhood. He invited all the leaders to his swearing-in ceremony. And since then, apart from Bangladesh, I don't think anything has gone right for them. You have had an election in Maldives recently, and I still think there has been a little bit of lack of clarity vis-a-vis India's approach, or even the government there is struggling to transition into the next civilian government. So, what is going on?
Basically, I think, as you say, the inauguration was right. He invited all the South Asian leaders, and they got there, and everybody thought that this was a beginning of a new South Asia, really, the dawning of a new South Asia. That turned out not to be the case. I think he has ended up alienating, and we can discuss in each case, but Maldives, Sri Lanka, Nepal in particular, Bangladesh also, we haven't, because the riverine boundaries and so on, there's still a real problem. And the Tista Valley waters, we haven't signed it. And that's still a thing with Dhaka. And Bhutan, of course, is virtually a protectorate, so they don't have much say. But the Chinese are playing a very canny game in Thimphu, in Bhutan, in trying to get them on their side with a lot of the usual dead book diplomacy, except in this case, these are outright grants, because they understand that Bhutanese cannot pay them back, and so on. The railway line they're building into Nepal, into Kathmandu from Shigatse, it's the loop on the King Haile Lhasa railway, really is going to create such problems for us if we do not counter the potential avenue of ingress, as it were. It's not just the Brahmaputra Valley anymore, it's through the entire Nepalese border, which is permeable, entirely porous border. So we may have a real problem. And so we have no friends in South Asia, honestly.
Sorry, you were talking about the sanctions, one of the areas that our program covers.
In fact, that's what my book deals in some length as to where there's divergences with the United States, Iran in particular, Russian armament supply, the other issue. Iran, we have Iranian leaders coming into Delhi, and they can't make sense of it, strategic sense of it, honestly. Nor can I. I mean, when I'm asked by Iranians, as I have been, explain to us, I can't. I really say, there's no strategic logic. Unless you define your interests as U.S. interests, which cannot be the case. U.S. is on the other side of the globe. We are next to Iran. I'm right there. We have traditional historic links that go back centuries. Entire court culture, through the Mughals and so on and so forth, has been Persian. That was the official language until 1910, or whenever it is that Curzon set up his Raj imperial capital in Calcutta. So I think the problem is not the Americans. It's that we don't seem to follow our own best instincts in terms of addressing how best to further our interests. Naturally, if you go to the Americans, they'll try and saddle you with a solution that's going to be helpful to them. But the Americans can't be blamed then for Delhi accepting their advice. So that's the point I always made. And we can't then end up, as I said, Modi does this, and I put it to his lack of formal education. I mean, he says that he has earned his MA or something somewhere, and we don't know what kind of an MA he has earned from where. But essentially, he has a great, I must say, he has a terrific memory. He's almost mimetic. His memory is mimetic. I mean, he can recall a factoid from, and he'll stun you with factoids and insights that he has got from somewhere. And he doesn't have patience for long policy briefs. Everybody who meets with him is told nothing more than 5 pictograms or 2 pages or whichever comes first or whatever it is. That sort of thing. He doesn't have attention span. And this is also a problem. If you are going to be all the policy is going to be centrally driven, then if you are your own think tank, you are the sole fount of all ideas in Indian government, then you better also know in some depth all the areas that you want to be master of, which of course patently is not the case. I mean, and I just talked to Bharat here, and you have most of the American economists who were imported by Modi in his first few years. Raghu Rajan was there from Manmohan Singh's time from the University of Chicago, Arvind Subramaniam from Peterson Institute here, and then Panagaria from Columbia. I mean, we knew in Delhi that they were not listened to at all. I mean, many of them couldn't get an audience with the Prime Minister. So, you just have a title, economic advisor to the government, which means squat. It means nothing. And so it becomes frustrating. That's why they left Arvind Subramaniam in particular, I know that. And that's true if you ask him, honestly, candidly, what was your experience like dealing with the Indian government and Modi in particular, he'll tell you this, that it's very difficult, no one pays heed. And you have Doal, who is NSA, who I've known him for 30 years. He's just a provincial policeman. In a sense, he simply doesn't have a strategic sense at all. He may have instincts that are again limited to Pakistan, because he pulled off some intelligence operations, something or the other, and he tries to pad up that legend of his, of what he did covertly in Pakistan or something. How much of that is myth, I have no idea, and I have no way of knowing. But that is what he has played on. But he told a previous national security advisor who went to call on him after he took over as NSA, he said, he was asked, well, what do you think your job is? I'm paraphrasing the previous NSA. And that's there also in the book. I can't identify him. But and Doal says very straightforwardly that I don't think. I'm here. This is what the present NSA says to his predecessor, one of his predecessors. I'm here to merely implement boss's ideas. That's it. And in the rest of the Indian government, it's entirely PMO driven. So what Doal understands to be whatever it is that Modi wants done is what gets done, which again, the lower down you go, the more, there's that refraction that happens in terms of policy terms where things get diverted.
Thank you again. Let me suggest if you want to ask a question or make a comment, keep it brief. Please identify yourself and use the microphone if you can, so that we can record your voice. Certainly, but yeah. Please identify yourself and then ask your question.
Dr. Bharat, my name is Kami Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator. And normally I don't get seat here, so I ask question to politician. And you can't expect politician to be honest. So I kind of no, I'm known as a stone thrower who just asks questions to these dishonest people and then leave the scene. But with scholars, they are mostly, I would say, 100% honest. So I wanted to repeat my question, what I asked a question to Dr. Bharat. Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Lal. He is in California. He teaches there. He was at the Heritage Foundation, but my phone need to be discharged. It need to be charged, and so I would read this same. I would turn on the same question, and you can respond me about that. It's about Kashmir. But since you talk about this issue of Prime Minister Modi, I wanted to ask you about his relationship with Nawaz Sharif. Because what happened, Pakistan is the most important variable once you talk about India. And Pakistani army doesn't respect Nawaz Sharif. I spent almost 1 year in Pakistan a couple of years ago, and I got involved with MI, military intelligence. They were so kind to me, they gave me a military intelligence jeep. I was working for the guy who wanted to become mayor of Lahore, Arif Hamid Butt. His sister married with Nawaz Sharif's youngest brother. So I thought, he could set me somewhere. So military was very, MI guy was very kind to me, and they gave me a jeep. So during that process month, I learned lot about how military, they are very nice and very kind, and they don't have any animosity toward India. As a matter of fact, I socialize with drivers and, people who are, and what I learned that when they want to throw some bomb in India, they informed Indian commander or whoever, that we are going to do that, so save your guys. And same thing is done by Pakistani. So that made me think that it's a kind of conspiracy general on both sides. They are somehow causing the wastage of resources on both sides. Dr. Lal gave me the same answer. He told what you just said, that India should remove its, India has like over 70% of its military power on Pakistani border, and Pakistan is not a threat. So Dr. Lal told me the same thing, that India should remove it. So my question, I'm sorry, I have tendency to ramble. So about Nawaz Sharif, what I used to hear from military intelligence, that Nawaz Sharif would be off the scene anytime, and this was in 2014. They hate him. They don't trust him. But what Imran did a very good job. He has very good, lot of goodwill in India. So he wanted to initiate a conversation with Modi. But what Modi did is not very nice with this guy. I consider Imran very straightforward, very honest guy. But what Modi did, Modi suddenly withdrew. So what was his motivation? I mean, basically, I'm sorry, I'm not prejudiced, but I teach you very bad thing about Hindu in Pakistan. So I was raised up, and they teach you that, Hindu are very narrow-minded. Look at their architecture of mosque and mandar. What is the big difference? So what Modi did is the same thing, basically. He is kind of perpetuating the prejudice of Pakistani children that these people are not reliable. They want to, divide you. They want you to fight. They don't want to have peace with you. By doing that, basically...
Got your question.
Okay.
Let's get the answer.
Sure.
No, basically, I think one of the
it's
things...
a valid point about the relationship.
one of the things is that, the India-Pakistan relations are really an externalization of the, traditional Hindu-Muslim tensions in Indian society. It's just an externalization. That's all it is. Nothing more. It's really not foreign policy in terms of, all that, mean. So that's the trouble. For Modi, it helps, as I said, to be socially disruptive in terms of polarizing the society to help himself in elections.
Dov Zedekind, I'm a director at the Atlanta Council and a few other things. A couple of observations, Bharat. First of all, you left out one other autocratic type, Bibi Netanyahu, who also has a problem with submarines like your prime minister has with aircraft. You also, in your comparing my president with your leader, you didn't mention that my president doesn't exactly have a long attention span and kind of likes to hear things the way yours does, but also thinks he knows everything. And finally, the last observation, when you were talking about the LSA and these agreements, and here I'm simply speaking as somebody who was Undersecretary of Defense. I mean, we put our proposals together, and then our lawyers who all lawyers drive everybody crazy, and our lawyers are no different. But when we go into a negotiation, and I've done a few of those, you expect something to come back. So if something's not coming back, that's really not our problem. And finally, my question is this. You seem to imply that we have a strategy that's very generous of you. I'd say Christian of you, but I don't think you are. Neither am I, so. But because we have no strategy, the strategy of the bureaucracy has essentially, which does have a strategy, has essentially been to keep as much as possible below the White House radar. Is that what your bureaucracy is doing?
I think one of the attitude of the bureaucracy is sort of, I reproduced it from very senior civil servant here. He says, look, we are the permanent secretariat. We are the landlords. And the politician of the day, the government of the day, are tenants. We know our permanent interests and the national interests. These guys are just transients. That is the attitude. And therefore, this might be the case with all bureaucracies across the board. But the point to make, I think, is that in India, in America, you're absolutely right. And I say this, I use Kissinger's thing, that America doesn't have to have a strategy because it has an amplitude of resources. If there's a problem, you merely mobilize and deploy the resources, whatever is required to deal with the problem. We can't afford that. So we have to have a strategy, which is what I say in this book. And the absence of strategy costs India far dearer than it does more advanced countries, where we have to look out, be more rational and reasonable in allocating resources to see what the outcomes are, and so on. And this is what we don't do, the bureaucracy doesn't do. When you talk about legalistic, that's precisely it. Our legal team in the MEA, insofar as, and I don't know about the MOD, which must be worse, honestly, because I know the international law division in the MEA. These guys are just generalists again who come in on a rotational basis. They don't understand a thing. I mean, they didn't even know, by the way, should I just show you, what a ceasefire line, when Musharraf said that the LOC is a ceasefire line, and in international law, when I pointed out that ceasefire line means either side can change the line to its advantage using any means it deems necessary. And the NBA was up in arms and jumping up and down. I got a call saying, what are you saying? Don't you know your international law? This is the problem. So we don't have lawyers like you do who go into the minutiae of international law. They understand the nuance. Our people are generalists in every ministry. So when you say that you went in with an agenda which was specific and you got nothing in return, precisely the problem. And therefore, by the way, Shuja, I say in this book that if you do nothing else, then look at the example that Pakistan has had with the US. Because you have had no experience dealing with the United States as the Pakistanis have. Learn from their experience, but to our advantage. In terms of, look, ultimately, if it comes down to, in the Indo-Pacific, if it comes down to choosing between India and Pakistan, America will naturally choose India. We are far bigger, we have far better resources in every way, and anybody would choose India. But if we do not have the kind of focus that I think Islamabad is able to summon, far better, which may not be very well, very good in terms of actual outcomes, realizing outcomes, but in terms of normal, there's a coherence. Even if it comes from GHQ Rawalpindi, the Chief of the Army Staff, Bajwa, says something, that line goes down and is followed through, which is not the case in India. So, as was said of the last Mughal emperor, his writ ran from the Red Fort to Palam. That's the airport. It was about 12 miles. That's how it is. In terms of Modi or any prime minister, if he doesn't have the bureaucracy on his side, the permanent secretariat on his side, he can't do anything. And all he can then issue are obiter dicta, which mean nothing. The bureaucracy can say, heck with it. I mean, I know secretaries of the government saying, well, I have another 6 months to serve, or a month, a year to serve. I don't care. I mean, they don't say I don't care. They say, well, I have 6 months to go, or a year.
Thank you. And thank you, Dob, for explaining for the general audience that it's the lawyers, really. I didn't mean the other folks in the Pentagon, because particularly having seen some of the agreements between the U.S. and Pakistan, the U.S. basically sidelined the Pakistani Ministry of Foreign Affairs entirely. They were not even included in the discussion or the signatures. It was with the MOD, with a lower rank joint secretary. In the subcontinent, we call them the competent authority,
Joint secretaries.
which is not the right term. It's like military intelligence, So
Oxymoron.
it's an oxymoron. The competent authority runs South Asia.
I'm Shahid Yusuf. I'm Chief Economist at the Growth Dialogue, and I teach at SAIS. Thanks for the preview of your book. Seems very interesting. I look forward to reading it. My question is to do with what you said about India's growth. It needs to grow rapidly in order to absorb these 12 million new entrants, plus the overhang of and underemployed people. The question is, does anybody in India have an idea or a policy, whether it's a continuation of the past or new policies that would accelerate growth in a deglobalizing world, or a world where globalization is probably going to mark time? So is there anything which will take India to 9%, 10% growth rates comparable to China? And is Modi likely to succeed? And secondarily, as an economist, for India to react to the United States by levying tariffs would be a lose-lose proposition. Its own industries would pay the price. So I would imagine that a tit-for-tat with the United States would probably be poor policy, but I'd appreciate your view on these.
I should say I'm not an economist. So fortunately, because that requires a lot more of that sort of knowledge than I have. I merely, to the extent that I delved into economic issues at all, I've quoted experts who I think know better. In terms of skilling, which is really the problem in employment generation in India, again, Modi started out, he's making everything a government-driven program, instead of what he promised, and which is what I was enthused by, when he talked about government having no business to be in business. That was his campaign slogan in 2014. Many of us, I'm an Edmund Burkean conservative. I like that. I like the fact that the government is restricted and it should be shrunk even more. And it doesn't trust the private sector. Even though he says, I have great business sense, I'm a Gujarati, business is in my blood, by the way, these are his words, and so on and so forth. He doesn't trust the profit motive. He somehow thinks in India, profit is still in bad odor for some reason. It's very strange. So you end up having those benefiting from the system are crony capitalists, precisely like in the Rafale. You have an Ambani, rather than a whole slew of very imaginative entrepreneurs and so on and so forth, who have to look for startup money and capital and so on in Silicon Valley, or now China is coming in a very big way into the Indian market. And the Indian government seems to be entirely unmindful of the dangers, when actually we have the resources to back up the startup option. But if you're going to make the government the driver of every program, then you are, in one sense, fated to failure, to achieve failure, because government is not the answer. But even Modi, whom I, again, believed was the answer, he really believed, it's not so. He believes, as I said, he believes in the system. He thinks he can make the system work, despite 4 years of being at the helm and achieving nothing except rhetorical flourishes in real sense. If you look at even the economic indices, it's like Trump claiming economic success. I mean, it's remarkable what the parallel tracks all these autocrats are on. The previous governments, whatever their policies, they got them going, and then they claim the successes as their own when the system has achieved a certain threshold of achievement. Anyway, that's the case in India, certainly. And that is hurting us because our private sector is otherwise so vigorous. But, once you have the dead hand of the Indian government into it, that's why Make in India, for instance, is such a failure. It cannot wrap its mind around what it wants. Make in India is for Modi, and I'm being perhaps exaggerating, but only to make a point, is screwdrivering a 40-year-old plane, the F-16, in India. I mean, it beggars your strategic sense to make really to understand Indian policy and the way Mr. Modi's brain works or doesn't, and I'm therefore almost always at a loss. I met him once. He called me in once for a consultation, and I suddenly realized that when he meets with so-called experts, which I'm given to understand he does now and then, he uses people he calls in as a sounding board for his own ideas. And many of his ideas are extraordinarily banal. So you don't know how to react to them, except in terms of, mom and apple pie kind of things. Everybody is for it. Yeah, okay, good. So what do you do? And he'll try to dress it up and so on and so forth. And then you're just sitting there and you don't know how to react. And then you give him something to read. I did, 3 pages, but I was told no more than 3 pages. So I kept it down to simple language, 3 pages, bold font and so on. It had no effect whatsoever. So, so you hear from the BJP, because I was close to many people in the previous BJP government, and Jaswant and KC Pant and all those others. So, and RSS, I don't know how many of you have followed Mohan Bhagwat's latest, he's trying to make RSS ideology acceptable to the Indian population. I was invited to it, so I was sitting there listening to him for 3 days. Everything is at length, but in India, so we talk a lot, but very little gets done. But he's trying to make RSS ideology more acceptable, more liberal, even as, like all other alpha male, strongman leaders, they have made their states more illiberal, as has Modi in India. But the RSS chief, the way he, for 3 days, he's tried to recalibrate the RSS ideology within the Indian context. It is stunning, because he makes himself out to be the new avatar of liberalism in India. All he asks, he says, of Muslims, always the Muslims, is that they accept the fact that they are derived from the Hindu civilization, which means nothing. Hindu is take off from the river Indus, as many of you are aware. So that means what? Hinduism is not really a religion. It's just, something. So, it's very difficult.
Thank you. We have a question here, and then I have 2 other questions, Shurupa and then Seema.
Uzair Yunus from the Albright Stonebridge Group. You mentioned about, alpha males and around the world. The other thing that I find in common with them is in their second term, or usually after a few years in power, they adopt a more muscular domestic and foreign policy approach. By all polls, it seems like Mr. Modi will be back in another term. Where do you see that if you see that muscularity being showcased around the neighborhood, do you see that in the neighborhood, or where would you see the scenario as a flashpoint in that muscular foreign policy?
The only muscularities I see in policy is his rhetoric against Pakistan and his repeated threats of unleashing surgical strikes. Now, if you looked at the so-called surgical strike we mounted, It was the normal special ops that we carry out in a very silly fashion without trying to get into too much detail, but they're almost farcical in the sense you just go across, you blow up a culvert and come back and you say it's a surgical strike. I'm exaggerating, but only slightly. By that I mean, you see, these are not strategic special forces actions. And I think the India-Pakistan, the entire conflict is so farcical. It is almost, borders on the ridiculous. And the best description, and there's also a very dismissive explanation of India-Pakistan wars, which I subscribe to fully, was Major General D.K. Palit. He was the General Officer commanding 24 Infantry Division, and then he was the Director Military Operations 62 Ops against China. And he was kicked out because it was badly done. The whole thing went kaput. But he was perhaps the greatest scholar soldier any subcontinental army has produced so far. Really a tremendous intellect, and I had the great privilege to know him well. And he described India-Pakistan wars as communal riots with tanks. Exactly. Communal riots with tanks. And I remember talking to General Palit and asking, General, were you being facile or was this a serious description? And he said to me, and he of course pulled himself to full height, 6 feet or something, and he says, I never joke. So I said, all right. Then I said, I'll use your template to analyze India-Pakistan wars, so-called wars. As I always use the word so-called when I talk about India-Pakistan conflicts. And lo and behold, most of the India-Pakistan wars, and this was published in the Round Table in London in 1996, it's been there in all my writings ever since. In all the India-Pakistan wars, they all conform to the metrics of riots, communal riots. Literally, quite literally, in times of time constraint, no India-Pakistan war has lasted, other than Kargil, more than 12 days. Like a riot, it doesn't go on and on, it's very short. It's space constrained, exactly, right? It is intensity constrained. No counter-city bombardment, no nothing, right? It's just people going at each other in a counter-force, tank on tank or unit on unit, infantry attack, completely ridiculous stuff. And then most of the things are even more farcical because both the armies are on the same Bravo link frequencies. They speak on the same radio frequencies in battle. So, I mean, all you have to do is listen and say, okay. So the idea, as I've said, is, I mean, that's the case. Why? Because these are partitioned armies. They're partitioned regiments of the army. And these ties are very strong. And this is the point I made in the roundtable piece I wrote, wherein I said the best confidence and security building exercise in South Asia would be for the Indian and Pakistan armies to, come back and have a bridging kind of exercise of all kinds to get them together again as a confidence and security building measure for both countries and all of South Asia. Because you have armor regiments of great repute and infantry regiments of great repute that were actually partitioned along Muslim units and Hindu and Sikh units and so on and so forth. It's a ridiculous sort of thing. But you had this. Now get them together because the regimental histories are, in each other's messes and headquarters. So, and people still pine for them. It's just remarkable how you go to Cinderhorse in India and you go to Jacob's, what is it, not Jacob, what was Zia's regiment? Province. And that, by the way, Province should have come to India.
No, two squadrons went to India.
Yes, but Province Mess didn't, the Mess Silver didn't come to India. You guys retained it. That was the richest regiment of the Indian Army, the armored regiment, the Province Horse. We, of course, got Deccan Horse and Pune Horse and 17 Horse and Central India Horse and so on. Still, they're called the Horse. So in the 21st century, these regiments are still known by horse cavalry regiments. So, I mean, there's no cavalry in sight. But, so. Anyway, this is fun and games in terms of the Indian Army and its legend. because the most ironical thing is we won the empire for the British. Indian arms won the empire for the British. We are the ultimate mercenaries. And there's no way around it.
Thank you. Probin's horse is one of my family regiments, so I know a bit of the history of Probin's and Hodson's horse exchanged 2 squadrons at the time of partition. I have 2 questions here. If we can keep the questions and answers short, I'd appreciate it, because we stop at 4:30. Thank you.
Very short question, actually. Shurupa Gupta, University of Mary Washington. You talked about taking the C out of BRICS, and I'm wondering, there used to be something called the IBSA, and that didn't go anywhere. How do you see BRICS minus C going anywhere? Thanks.
You're right, IBSA didn't go anywhere. But then the problem, I think, is that India has never been serious about these groupings. You know, it talks about these meets when you have them in Delhi, or when Modi goes out, or the Indian Prime Minister before went out to various capitals, the IBSA capitals and so on. But the point I'm trying to make is, somewhere down the line, someone has to get the idea that if you can't do it on your own, it's best to have coalitions. But then to partner an America or a China in any kind of exercise is in some ways to also end up limiting yourself in terms of India. Because ultimately, when you partner with the United States, you're going to end up furthering American interests more than you're going to end up, furthering Indian interests. That's the point I always made, and that's even more so with China. But right now, in vis-a-vis the Mod Quad, certainly, I've been on 1.5 track with the Japanese, who, I mean, it's stunning what they say, and it's unlike anything you hear formally from the Japanese government. And these are senior admirals and so on. They are frustrated with India because many of you perhaps are tracking the Shinmaiwa US-2 episode, where the Japanese have offered us perhaps the finest amphibious plane in the world on a platter as a flagship Make India program. Fully, they're going to fully transfer everything to India, including the design wherewithal, everything, and we are hesitating. For 4 years, Modi has been just nodding his head and doing nothing. As I said, it's so frustrating that one doesn't know what to make of it. And, and people in government are unwilling to say why they are not proceeding with what the Japanese are offering. They are offered everything, including the financing, and so on and so forth. Everything. But and as written here somewhere in the book, that if you keep looking the gift horses in the mouth, they might turn away. And the Japanese are just at that point where everybody's frustrated. That's why, for instance, after the Shinmaiwa experience, when the Indian Navy asked for open tenders on help on the 75I conventional diesel submarines, the Japanese backed off. They say, we had bad experience with the Shinmaiwa. The corporate culture is, they share their opinions and views. And they just said, no, we won't even come in with the RFI, the request for information. They said, don't want to get in the process at all. And Shinmaiwa is just there. And we can take it anytime, but we are not. The Shinkansen railway technology, the high-speed technology, again is hanging fire because the Indian government has not been able to facilitate the acquisition of land to build the high-speed, rail corridor from Bombay to Ahmedabad. So this is how, we end up being our own worst enemies.
Thank you, Bharat. Seema.
Hi, Seema Siroi. I'm a columnist based in DC. A couple of comments. I mean, you are very critical of the US-India partnership, but many people argue and they believe that if India and US are good friends, other countries take us more seriously. I mean, many of our other relationships have blossomed because, the Americans gave India some importance for whatever reason. And obviously, India also saw some of its own interest in that. So that's one comment. And the other about the Russians. The Russians will sell us whatever we want or lease us whatever we want if you give them hard cash. They are selling everybody everything. Chinese have taken them for a ride. I don't know, I was reading recently, there was some plane the Chinese ordered. They took the delivery of 2 of those Russian planes, copied them, and canceled the rest of the orders. So, the Russians are desperate. So in terms of, angering and making them upset because we have a relationship with the US, I'm not so convinced. My question is about Pakistan. You said that it's very easily co-optable. Tell me how. Because in India is a democracy, every politician, forget Modi, if it was Manmohan Singh or Vajpayee or any other prime minister we've had, every time there's an attempt to start a dialogue, there's a massive terrorist attack, or there's an operation from the Pakistani side. So I don't know from why I should believe that the Pakistan army and Indian army will get together and share their, mess and all that camaraderie again.
Yeah, I mean, I just point you to Asad Durrani's and A.S. Dulat's interactions that has led to a book. I'm sure you've at least know of it, if not read it. You'll see there a basic level of mutual understanding and appreciation that's there, and that really runs right through the Pakistani establishment, which Shuja can attest to. And certainly I'd know of it in the Indian military, which is supposed to be the strong arm and so on and so forth. These are not really serious rivalries. Everybody understands. I'm including. I was in some seminar at senior levels with General Rawat, and I told him frankly. I mean, he was a co-commander at a time when General V.K. Singh was the army chief, and we met in Nainital somewhere. And I was speaking to the commanders there, co-commanders, and I said, well, if you do not prepare for China and you lead up for preparation in offensive mountain corps, those kinds of things that I've been advocating for 30 odd years, if you don't take it up, it'll take you another 30 years to build up to that capability. So when are you going to decide that you have had enough of Pakistan in terms of being a reasonable, Pakistan being a not really sufficiently big enough adversary for India to worry about, and so on. The co-optable nature of Pakistan is precisely in the Nawaz Sharif interactions. As you perhaps are aware, and again, Shuja may perhaps knows better, many of the most, leading families, wealthy families in Pakistan have interests in India, investments in India. I won't name them, but they actually have investments in India in terms of real estate and so on. It's like kind of a bolt hole, if I may say that. I mean, because you don't know. Given the parlous situation, context in which Pakistan finds itself at most times, it may improve, I hope it does. And because I've always talked of Pakistan, I've said that if Pakistan weren't there, we'd have to invent it, because it's a very good thing Pakistan happened, because it acts as a cordon sanitaire, as a buffer state, which we wouldn't have had Pakistan not been there, and we're not using it as such. Anyway, its co-optable nature is precisely in terms of basic economic sense. If you can run a train of freight cars full of Jharia coal on the broad gauge track right to the factory gates of Karachi, why would you pay 7 times as much to import coal from New South Wales and Australia? I mean, why? Beyond a point, it doesn't make sense. I've therefore said that, India would have to take the initiative in terms of restructuring its armed forces, like demobilizing 3 strike corps, and doing this unilaterally, not as part of any negotiated restancing or restructuring, but unilaterally, because you lose nothing. The Pakistanis can't do it.
They will stop the terrorist attacks.
No, they won't stop the terrorist attack. But then who's to say that you don't wield the same kind of covert means in Pakistani provinces? I don't know. Can we be certain that our intel agencies don't use them? What I mean is that will continue until the GHQ Rawalpindi realizes that, look, what's the other unilateral thing I've been advocating? You completely remove all the nuclearized short-range and medium-range ballistic missiles and cruise missiles from the western border of India. Do it unilaterally. Demobilize 3 strike corps, restructure, put it on the China front. It may not immediately convince GHQ Rawalpindi that India means good. That's fine. For 20 years on, they will see that maybe it'll convince some people. In any case, even if it doesn't hurt us, because you can keep all the other means that you engage in, like covert means, intel operations and so on. Keep them up if you feel that that's what serves your purposes. But get rid of the main provocations that the GHQ Rawalpindi swears by. Why are you afraid? Because you have 3 strike corps. Is that right? Very simply, that's the Pakistani raison d'etre for the enmity with India. You have ready forces. How can we believe you that you will not unleash them on us at any time of your choosing? We can't argue because we're all right there. Our forces are right there. Unless you restructure. And the economic sense makes, there's no need to belabor that point. It's so obvious. The subcontinental market, if you regain it.
Thank you. Just to wrap that up, and I'm sorry that this came as the last question because it probably needs a whole new session unto itself. I hope Bharat can organize that at some point so we can explore this particular issue. Just 2 things worth keeping in mind. The Pakistani military says that we don't know how to measure intent, but we can measure the capacity. And that's really what guides their thinking. The other is the report that most of us have seen from the National Intelligence Council, the 2012 report, the 2030 scenario, talked about the fact that India's economy, which was 7 times Pakistan's economy at that point, by 2030 would be 16 times the size of Pakistan's economy. There is no way on earth that India and Pakistan, or Pakistan can match India, or create a good equilibrium that would help it. So if India does some of the things that Bharat suggests, and I doubt that that'll happen, frankly, given current trends, it will strengthen the hands of those people in Pakistan that are looking for economic growth and trade opportunities. So instead of having a $2 billion trade with India and a few billion more via Singapore and Dubai, you can have between $40 and $100 billion a year of trade between India and Pakistan.
I know that India offered the past 2 times. They have offered. It's Pakistan doesn't want to even allow trucks to go through to Afghanistan.
Well, that has to change. That has to change, and that's why I say that maybe we need to explore this.
Let's remember all the times that these exact deals have been offered by Manmohan Singh. Even electricity boards. There was talk that India would sell electricity from Punjab to Pakistan.
Seema, we
Yes.
have wine waiting.
Yes. Thank you, Bharat, and thank you all of you, and it's always a pleasure to be back here. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you. We have a small reception outside, so the conversation can continue there. Thank you.
Nice job.